What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis-tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted drugs. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. https://youtube.b/UCH7MTFJTBW. Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit, thanks for the award. A lot of Salmonella fans, huh? The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s, they took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve the unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden box often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home. The cadaver synod, basically the Pope had a previous Pope's corpse exhumed so the corpse could stand trial for something made up. So they dug up his bloated 7-month-old corpse and convicted him, retroactively nullifying his papacy. Then they dumped his bloated and convicted corpse in a river. The people got pissed and overthrew the Pope, who was strangled in prison. The next Pope came along and had the corpse collected from the river and its papacy posthumously reinstated. 897 was a crazy year. The San Francisco Plague of 1900 to 1904 was a terrible, scary time when the Black Plague was beginning to ravage San Francisco. California's governor tried to suppress information about the outbreak and restrict any activities to curtail it because he feared economic damage to the state. He even tried to get the doctor who was warning people about the outbreak fired. What information did get out was used against the Chinese residents, as it was believed that it was a disease of the unclean. Had it not been for the earthquake in 1906 that devastated the city, the plague outbreak would have probably been more remembered. During Prohibition, the government funded and led an operation to release barrels of alcohol that they had poisoned to make people sick and shy away from bootleg liquor. Lots of people ended up dying, but people still drank more than ever. The Halifax explosion, regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917. There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically, there were two types of Rwanda natives: the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs, and after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis, yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never like using that term because of its association with World War II and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killings stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were. In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snake bite. Just a snake bite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed. The sad case of Otabenga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa. Then World War I happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot. The death of Roger Williamson, at the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. In the 1970s era of Formula One, the cars weren't far off from being an overpriced metal coffin on wheels, surrounded by highly flammable fuel, and during the Dutch Grand Prix, this became painfully obvious indeed. Roger Williamson crashed out after a tire puncture, and his car came to rest upside down, with him trapped inside. He was not seriously hurt by the crash, but then the fuel tank ignited and the car burst into flames. Another driver named David Purley was behind Williamson when the crash occurred, and he saw the whole crash unfold. Purley stopped his car on the other side of the track, ran across an active racetrack, and proceeded to try and save Williamson's life. This is where the dark part of it comes in, and depending on your sensibilities, downright outrageous and disgraceful. None of the trackside marshals had any fireproof equipment, which prevented any of them from helping Purley to right the burning car. They also had a grand total of one fire extinguisher between them, which was incapable of putting out the flames. Additionally, not a single other driver who saw the calamity stopped to help, despite Purley's frantic waving to them, to try and get anyone to assist in saving Williamson's life. Meanwhile, race control decided not to halt the race despite a flaming wreck being present on track, and it took almost 10 minutes before the fire engine arrived on site, by which point, Williamson had asphyxiated from the smoke and flames. As soon as the fire was out, they simply put a blanket over the burned-out car and continued racing. Later on, other drivers and the race controllers would claim that they assumed Williamson's car was actually Purley's, and that there was no one at risk at that time, something that the many hundreds of people within the grandstands would strongly disagree with. Williamson burned to death right in front of a grandstand packed with spectators, who all got a front row seat to watching Williamson die before their very eyes. So there you have it, a young, promising driver slowly being burnt alive over the course of 10 minutes, a second driver desperately trying in vain to save his life, a group of marshals woefully under-equipped for the job, indifferent drivers, incompetent race control, and a disaster which shook Formula One to its core. As a result of this debacle, changes were made to try and avoid this type of event occurring again in the future. The biggest change was the mandate that marshals should wear fireproof clothing, and it was also noted that drivers were more willing to stop at accident sites to assist in rescuing fellow drivers. This was most clearly seen during the 1976 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, where Guy Edwards, Harold Ertl, Brett Lunger and Arturo Merzario all pulled over to assist in getting Niki Lauda out of his burning Ferrari, after the infamous crash that took him out of the German, Austrian, and Dutch Grand Prix. The Vibe experiment. Sweden are mostly known as a not very scary country, with good and mostly accessible dental care. Well, part of how that came to be is this, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/vime_experiments. Hey, you are institutionalized and suffering and powerless, let's make your teeth rot out of your skull. For science. In the 1920s, the Osage Indians, Oklahoma, USA, discovered one of the largest oil fields on Earth. They went from being poor to being the richest civilization on Earth overnight. Imagine Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Elon Musk living on the same street. The Osage were building mansions, hiring servants, driving exotic cars, and the women were marrying white men as trophy husbands. It wasn't long before people started moving into town and exploiting them. Slowly, one by one, they began being murdered. By the end, hundreds had died. The men were hiring people to kill their wives. Lawyers were drawing contracts to transfer oil rights and tricking the Osage into signing them. It was so crazy that it led to the birth of the FBI. This was one of their original investigations, and is still largely unsolved. Martin Scorsese is currently writing/directing a movie about it. It's going to be based on the book Killers of the Flower Moon, which is where I learned about it. Super interesting read. Anyone who's familiar with Mary, Queen of Scots, most likely knows that she was beheaded, but many people don't know how she was beheaded. My Apush teacher told my class this story, and it's probably one of the most simultaneously interesting, funniest, and saddest executions in history. The first thing to note was that Mary wore a red dress rather than a white one for a very specific reason. After the execution of a royal or high-class person, commoners would often tear off blood-stained fabric from their clothing solely to flex that they got their hands on the blood of a noble. With red fabric, it would be difficult to see actual blood on the dress. Smart move on Mary's end. During the actual execution, it was said that Mary's executioner was not very experienced and actually missed the initial swing, jamming the axe or whatever weapon they used into the back of her head rather than through her neck. This didn't kill her yet, though, and she instead made some sort of medieval olden time exclamation that can be roughly translated to "goddamn." Edit. After the executioner was done, he picked up her head by the hair, not knowing it was a wig, and the head fell out and rolled onto the floor. Thanks plug_5 and Moyaoki for reminding me. After Mary was properly killed, her body was left for public viewing, but the audience was surprised to see her red dress start to rustle before allowing Mary's small terrier dog to climb out from underneath. Tragically, the dog refused to leave the body and eventually passed away after staying at the same spot for a lengthy amount of time. History buffs, please feel free to make any corrections, as I heard this story a while ago and probably made a few errors in my recalling. TL, Dr. Mary, Queen of Scots, avoided crazy memorabilia savers at her execution with a very intelligent move, got shanked in the head during a failed attempt. The executioner dropped her head onto the floor, and had her dog in her dress with her the entire time. The Radium Girls. In the 1920s, they worked at a watch company painting the hours on the watches using radium, a radioactive element that glows in the dark. They did this with no PPE and weren't told radium is dangerous. Meanwhile, the chemists had full PPE and worked in a sealed environment. Worse, they were instructed to lick the tip of the brush to make a very fine point. Some of them would paint their nails or their teeth with it for fun when they went out at night. They would develop cancer whenever the paint touched, and many of them had such decay in their jaws that their mandibles had to be held on with bandages. Edit. Apparently there's a new movie about this, as many Redditors have helpfully pointed out. The Massacre of Calavrita. It is a village in Greece. The Germans entered it and rounded up all the male villagers in a field. They then shot them all with machine guns. After that they got the children and women and put them in the church. When everyone was inside, they locked the doors and set fire to the church. Around 20 minutes into the burning, a German soldier couldn't take it anymore and opened the doors. Around half of the people escaped the fire, but the rest perished. The German soldier was shot for this, and if you go to Calavrita today, his name is on the memorial. No one was punished for this apart from the leader of the division, who I was told by my grandmother that he died in a gulag. But everyone else got away with it. It is sad that no one knows about this, as things like this happened all over Greece and Russia and Poland. I only know about this because my great-grandmother was one who escaped in the church. This massacre was in retaliation for the villagers supporting the local resistance force, which had recently killed about 10 Nazis. Kukikai, or the chicken poop prison in Thailand. Used by French forces to hold political prisoners, rebellious-type people, in the Chonthaburi region. The long-standing impacts of this much-feared torture are still felt in the region today. There's a Thai saying for those who buck authority that roughly translates to be careful not to get caught in a chicken poop prison. I learned about this prison from my parents who learned about it from theirs. How it worked was there was a small, 2-story prison. Bottom floor houses the prisoners, and the top floor is basically a huge chicken coop. The grated floor/ceiling ensures that the chicken poop falls onto the prisoners below. Apparently, even though the maximum sentence in Kukikai was around a week, it was one of the most feared punishments there was. Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry VII, father of Henry Vaish, was married off at age 12 to Edmund, 25, who was desperate to get her pregnant as quickly as he could. It was not unusual for members of the aristocracy to marry young. It was slightly more unusual, because of the risk to both mother and child, for them to get pregnant before the age of 14. Edmund died of plague while Margaret was pregnant. She was widowed and alone and pregnant during war. The birth was a very difficult one and would scar her forever. For a time they believed that she and her unborn child would perish. Not only was she very young, but she was also slight of stature and undeveloped for her age, so it's a wonder she even survived childbirth. It was so difficult for her that she never became pregnant again over the rest of her years, despite remarrying 2 more times. It is widely believed that she was physically damaged during the childbirth and was unable to conceive again, but it's also possible she was too traumatized to ever put herself in that situation again. Either way, Margaret devoted herself to her son, calling him my dearest and only desired joy in this world. Use of the Judas cradle for torture. The Judas cradle was a pyramid-shaped seat set up high where the victim would be seated on the pinnacle, while tied. The pyramid point would penetrate the victim's anus or vagina, and the sheer weight and movement of the person would slowly help it penetrate more. The torturer would sometimes add weight to the victim's legs, rock them, or add oil to the pyramid to increase the pain and quicken death. https://www.thescarichamber.com/Judas-cradle/ Magdalene asylums, also known as Magdalene laundries, places of reform for women that didn't fit the idea of a good upstanding citizen. The most well-known ones were in Ireland. The women and girls were abused and mistreated by asylum staff, most of whom were nuns. Here's the Wikipedia article, more sources at the bottom of the page. ETA, thank you to everyone adding on with more horror stories about this place. Mass graves, selling these women's children to people in other countries, blocking any parental rights. There's apparently at least one movie coming out, a lot of stories about it, and so many people sharing stories from their mothers and grandmothers. I guess it's more well known than I first thought. Croatia's Ustachas. Sick radical motherfuckers. An Ustacha that isn't able to take out a baby from its mother's womb with a blade, isn't a good Ustacha. Anti-Pavelic. Some of their most horrific crimes were burning babies in front of their parents, mangling kids from 0 to 14 years/show with axes, raping girls in front of their mothers, cutting off the ears and noses of their prisoners while being alive. Even the Nazis were horrified by these guys' methods. Highland clearances. Thousands of Scots were forcibly evicted from their homes, many were forcibly exported to Canada, the US or Australia, many who refused were massacred with whole villages of women and children raped, many died of starvation on the forced marches or from famine, all so they could farm sheep. Fuck Patrick Sellers. If you're interested in more morbid historical anecdotes and facts, I highly recommend r/The Gritty Past for that type of content. One that really stands out to me from the sub is this image of the Filipino zoo girl that was on display in the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. She was bound by ropes and people tossed peanuts at her. It's just heartbreaking to see something like that happen, especially to a child so young. Many people have no idea that human zoos existed, but they are definitely a dark part of history. What's crazy is that there have still been some that have popped up in the 21st century, although not as cruel as they used to be. The Cambodian genocide. You could have been killed just for wearing glasses, therefore being an intellectual. At least this was the Khmer Rouge logic. The prisoners were tortured so badly that they tried to commit suicide in every possible way, even by using some spoons. The executions used to be like this: the prisoners were put on a straight line and to the second prisoner was given an object like a shovel or a hammer which he had to use to kill the prisoner in front of him. Then, the same object was given to the third prisoners and the cycle would repeat until there was nobody alive except for the last prisoner on the line, who was then killed by the guards. Since many medics were killed or sent to work as farmers, the local regime used child medics to conduct experiments on the prisoners. They used teenagers with no knowledge of Western medicine to experiment on people without anesthesia. For example, they opened one person's chest just to see his heart beating. Imho, this shit is even worse than Unit 731. The January 1945 sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff. It was a German ship carrying fleeing Germans from the Eastern Front to the west through the Baltic Sea. It was sunk by the Soviet Navy shortly after setting sail. The total death toll is unknown but estimated at over 9,000 since there were so many stowaways. It is the worst maritime disaster ever, several times more than the Titanic. It didn't get nearly the press because they were the enemy, so who cares, and the Nazi media certainly didn't report it because they're at the waning days of a war they're badly losing, so the last thing they need is more hits to their already sinking morale. Madame Lalaurie, slave owner who tortured her slaves in horrifying ways. Evil shit. Mother and baby homes here in Ireland. Most Irish people will know about this, but most people from other countries don't. Basically, mother and baby homes, or laundries, were places run by nuns where women would be sent if they got pregnant before marriage, and would do all the laundry from people who sent their dirty clothes to the homes until they gave birth. During childbirth they would be provided with no real medical procedure, anesthesia etc., and the nuns would often verbally abuse them during the process for being so sinful as to have sex before marriage. When the baby was born, the umbilical cord was cut and that was the last contact the mother would have with the baby. Ever. The nuns would only ever rarely let the baby live, and if they did it would be abused by the nuns its whole childhood for being the product of sin. But, most of the babies didn't survive, and you would think, maybe, they would be killed humanely. Nope. Dropped into a septic tank. They've all been shut down now obviously, but they ran until the late 70s I believe. During excavations they would find the remains of around 300 newborn babies for each home. I apologize if any of this is a little inaccurate. I will gladly correct myself if I've gotten something wrong. The Children's Blizzard. It occurred in January 1888 on an unseasonably warm day. The weather was nice and many school kids were tricked into not wearing coats or jackets to school, some only in short sleeves. While the kids were in class, the weather outside changed dramatically from warm and sunny at noon to dark and heavy like a thunderstorm, with heavy winds and visibility at 3 steps by 3 p.m. Children left school to go home and do their chores, this was in Minnesota, and were expected to milk the cows and do whatever else was involved in the family farm. But they got lost in the darkness and snow and the wind and many froze to death in their town, just yards from houses or other sources of refuge. 235 people, mostly children, died. https://n. Wikipedia.org/wiki/schoolhouse_blizzard. There is a novel about the blizzard out now, and there is a non-fiction book about the event as well. I think they have the same title, different authors. The Children's Blizzard, non-fiction by David Laskin. The Children's Blizzard, fiction by Melanie Benjamin. Human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during World War II, committed primarily against innocent Chinese civilians. Nothing I've ever heard of in my life, including in fiction, is darker than the horrors committed for years by Unit 731, a military biological and chemical weapons research division of the Japanese Imperial Military. There's not enough room in a Reddit post to list half of it, but here's a taste: dissections of living babies, pregnant women, etc. without anesthesia, also known as a vivisection, usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and so on. Freezing limbs off of victims. Horror movie sadistic surgeries involving cutting off limbs and attaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, or removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without the organs to see what would happen, such as running the esophagus straight to the intestines with no stomach in between. Not to mention the fact that the victims were routinely raped and tortured for the sake of rape and torture, without even the flimsy excuse of science being conducted. And we're talking about thousands upon thousands of victims, usually hapless Chinese civilians, political prisoners, POWs, and the homeless, over the course of years in huge facilities with thousands of staff committing these atrocities. The icing on the cake? General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their war crimes so long as they share their findings with America and only America. Many of the former Unit 731 members even went on to have very successful and profitable futures in Japan after the war. Edit, based on a couple of the comments I've gotten where people are making judgment calls about the modern-day Japanese for this, I'd just like to make clear that I hold no prejudice against the Japanese, and I'm certainly not encouraging others to. Every country and people has truly horrific pasts, and almost all of them sweep it under the rug as best they can. Even in our generation. We can argue that torture conducted by US soldiers in Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, for example, aren't half as bad, or were more justified, but ultimately torture is torture and sadism is sadism. A culture or government that begins to permit such things and justify them is well on its way down the spiral with enough motivation. Let's not fool ourselves into comforting racism or nationalism that our countries or people are incapable of atrocities of our own. Even today. You know Jameson whiskey? Well, a long-ass time ago in like the 19th, one of their family heirs fed a little girl to cannibals. Like legit went and bought a little girl in the Congo as a slave and brought her up to a cannibal tribe because he wanted to see them. Sick fuck drew pictures of it and shit as it was happening. Of course for years the family tried to bury the fact, and the stories and such. Discredit the witnesses. But the crazy bastard was happy to document the whole thing. His only rebuttal in case it reflected badly on him was that he wanted to see if they would do it, and his accounts matched up with the evidence witnesses had provided. Edit, really lads? 2 wholesome awards? You didn't think a cute puppy or kitten deserved those accolades more? The hell is wrong with you people? The Parsley Massacre Dominican dictator really didn't like Haitians, so he ordered Dominican troops to the northern border region, which was fairly loose and undefined at that time, 1937, and told the troops to kill any Haitians on the Dominican side, which, again, was fairly unclear. How they determined who was Haitian and who was Dominican was based on how they pronounced the word parsley. The vowel sounds in French and Haitian Creole make a Creole or French speaker saying the Spanish word very obvious. The reports of what happened are truly horrific. Babies on bayonets, head bashed on trees, etc. And somewhere around 15-20k people were murdered in less than a week. Most Haitians have stories about extended family or friends who were hunted like animals and murdered, and it's said that the Dahobon River is where the murdered souls live. Lots of folks won't drink water or wash in the river because it is, still, a river of blood. It ran red during the massacre. The doctor paid reparations and citizens/survivors in Haiti got about 2 cents as their reparations because of corruption. The doctor is still engaged in trying to get rid of anyone that looks Haitian, read, dark-skinned, with regular deportation of even Dominican citizens who might be Haitian descended or are too dark-skinned to be Dominican, by state standards. It has created a huge crisis at the border. People are being forced into Haiti and don't speak Creole, don't have anywhere to go, and will never find work on Haiti. It's almost like the massacre never ended, just evolved. The sinking of the Sultana, which occurred in 1865. Legally allowed to carry 375 people, it was carrying over 2,300 recently released Union POWs, civilians and crew when the boiler exploded. About 1,800 people died from steam burns and drowning. Why so many people? Greed. The U.S. government would pay $2.75 per enlisted man and $8 per officer to any steamboat captain who would take a group north. So the captain took on more and more passengers. Plus the men were desperate to get home as the war had finally ended. The Sultana explosion occurred the same month the war ended and Lincoln was assassinated, so it was barely a blip in the news. https://n.m. Wikipedia. org/wiki/sultana_steamboat https://www. History. com/news/why nobody remembers America's worst maritime disaster. Everyone thinks of Chernobyl when they think of major industrial disasters in the modern era, but the disaster at Bhopal was 2 years prior to Chernobyl and much worse. Many times worse. If you want to go into a deep dive on how this happened, well, There's Your Problem has an excellent 2-part podcast on the engineering failures behind it and the true extent of the aftermath. The Battle of Hayes Pond. Robeson County, North Carolina. January 18, 1958. During the 1950s, the Lumbee Indians made nationwide news when they came into conflict with the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan headed by Klan Grand Dragon James W. Catfish Cole. At that time, Cole had begun a campaign of harassment against the Lumbee, claiming they were mongrels and half-breeds whose race mixing threatened to upset the established order of the segregated Jim Crow South. After giving a series of speeches denouncing the loose morals of Lumbee women, Cole burned a cross in the front yard of a Lumbee woman in St. Paul's, North Carolina, as a warning against race mixing. Emboldened, Cole called for a Klan rally on January 18, 1958, near the town of Maxton. The Lumbee, led by recent veterans of the Second World War, decided to disrupt the rally. The Battle of Hayes Pond, also known as the Klan Rout, made national news. Cole had predicted more than 5,000 Klansmen would show up for the rally, but fewer than 100 and possibly as few as 3 dozen attended. Approximately 500 Lumbee, armed with guns and sticks, gathered in a nearby swamp, and when they realized they possessed an overwhelming numerical advantage, attacked the Klansmen. The Lumbee encircled the Klansmen, opening fire and wounding 4 Klansmen in the first volley, none seriously. The remaining Klansmen panicked and fled. Cole was found in the swamps, arrested and tried for inciting a riot. The Lumbee celebrated the victory by burning Klan regalia and dancing around the open flames. The Battle of Hayes Pond, which marked the end of Klan activity in Robeson County, is celebrated as a Lumbee holiday. The Rape of Nanking. Some of the things I have read have made me physically sick. The story of Hisashi Ouchi and the Takimura incident. He was an employee at the Takimura nuclear plant when there was a disaster which led to him being exposed to nearly twice what is considered deadly in terms of gamma radiation, 17 sieverts. For reference, at the plant the workers were limited to 50 millisieverts of exposure yearly. So Ouchi got 340 years worth of safe exposure over the course of a few minutes. The levels have also been compared to what may have been present at the epicenter of the Hiroshima explosion. Ouchi was kept alive, against his will, for 83 days. He was just a shell of flesh and bone and completely lucid for about the first week, enduring pain and suffering most of us could never imagine. He asked doctors to let him die and they didn't. They just prolonged his suffering, and now we know what happens to the body when exposed to extreme levels of radiation. Your organs literally melt, your skin falls off, and it's worse than any horror movie. Oh, and this was in 1999. And the order for nearby residents and businesses to evacuate wasn't sent out for nearly 12 hours. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Takaimura_nuclear_accident. Not many people outside of Canada know about the abusive residential schools many Indigenous kids were forced to go to, up until the 90s, but even less know that many were also experimented on in the quest to cure tuberculosis. Truly sick stuff. The Tlatelolco massacre, a little-known mass shooting in Mexico City, where the Mexican armed forces fired upon unarmed civilians that were protesting the 1968 Olympics that would be held in Mexico City. Undetermined number of dead, around in the hundreds, and around 1,200 arrested. https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/murder_of_Junko_Furuta. This is just the saddest, most sickening thing to ever read. The French army also poured napalm on Algerians. But with more luck, no journalists, no camera, just a few confessions from pilots. The Chinese genocide in Mexico. With British attack on the French fleet after France's surrender Oradour-sur-Glane, Germans kill everyone in a small French town as retribution for local resistance attacks. The Volhynia massacres, incredibly brutal attacks on Poles by Ukrainian insurgents taking advantage of the chaos of the war to push their own goals. The Kefalonia massacre, after Italy surrendered, Germans took over the island and faced Italian resistance in the process, so they executed many of the prisoners, their former allies. Afterwards, post-war Indonesia's genocide in East Timor, the genocide against Georgians in Abkhazia. Child marriage in America isn't talked about as much as it should be. What's worse is that it's still a thing. Have you heard of Rare? He was born with a stupidly rare eating disorder and basically ate everything he found get his hands on, including a cadaver, and finally hit rock bottom when he ate a baby whole. None of my American history classes in high school taught the 1921 Tulsa massacre. I legit didn't know about it until I saw a comment on Reddit. Link for those curious. It might be commonly known, but the My Lane massacre. When people hear the word genocide, they think of the Nazis, then probably Stalinist or Maoist purges, mass relocations, and the like, Rwanda, and maybe the Armenian genocide. Colonialism has contributed massively to the history of genocide as well, but largely when people think of genocide, it's a distinctly 20th/21st century thing. But that's definitely not the case. The Circassian genocide was perpetrated by Russian Tsarist forces against namely the Circassian but also related ethnic groups in the Caucasus Mountains between the 1840s and 1870s. During that time, Russian and Cossack forces committed systematic torture and slaughter. Between the en masse killings and forced expulsion, it's estimated that there were between 800,000 and 1,500,000 casualties. Those who were lucky enough just to be forcibly expelled from their ancestral homeland largely became refugees in the Ottoman Empire, but some were forcibly relocated to the Russian imperial interior. Russia officially claims 400,000 killed in the Circassian migration, and only the country of Georgia officially recognizes this event as having been a genocide. It's thought that the Circassian genocide was a source of inspiration for the Armenian genocide in later years, and it is a foundational element of the long-held tensions with Russia in the Caucasus region. During the Somalia War in the 90s, member of Canada's Armed Forces Airborne Unit captured and tortured a black teenager, including sodomizing the boy. The backlash when this came to light was so horrible that the entire Canadian Airborne was disbanded, and many peacekeepers who fought in the medic pocket were silent about the trauma there because the military didn't want to further tarnish the name of the forces. The Armenian genocide wasn't even that long ago either. That solar eclipse on August 2, 1133. It was only dark for a little while, though. https://n Wikipedia org/wiki/Florida_school_for_boys Tuskegee syphilis study. The Korean comfort women under Imperial Japanese rule, World War II. The Japanese were as inhumane as the Nazis were, if not worse yet. All is forgiven by 2 nuclear bombs, so it seems. The Japanese government still has not confirmed that these atrocities happened. https://n Wikipedia org/wiki/death_of_Brian_Wells. The levels of state collusion in the murder of many innocent civilians in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. My mom told me about this when I was in grade 8, and she said she didn't know this until her last year of high school. During World War II, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Japanese internment camps were created in British Columbia. Many of the people in these camps were Japanese Canadians who never set foot in Japan. Many people including police and the RCMP didn't have any worries about them, but the government didn't trust them. Their land was sold and many fishing licenses were taken away. Some were even transported across Canada to do cheap labor. Many were also deported to Japan, a country that most of them had never been to. They weren't being compensated to re-immigrate until the 60s, I believe. No one got any compensation until the 1980s, almost 40 years after the event. Operation Condor. The US intelligence developed simultaneous coups in Latin America on the 70s. The strategy: kidnap, torture and disappear anyone related to socialist organizations. Only in Argentina, 30,000 people remain missing, including kids and babies. Well, in 1832 Spanish troops landed on Puerto Rico and raped, pillaged and destroyed a native tribe called Tainos. Learned about the tribe when we found out my husband's great times 9 grandfather was a chief that had 1 wife and 12 kids, all who survived to adulthood. Towards the end of the Second World War, a Japanese POW camp called Sandakan forced 2,400 Allied prisoners on a death march across Borneo. The marches were so brutal that 6 of those 2,400 men survived, each of whom eventually went insane when they returned home. The single worst atrocity suffered by Australian servicemen is also one of the least known. The William Cruz mass shooting in my hometown of Palm Bay, Florida, USA, in 1987. The Rohingya genocide. The Inuit people were brought to boarding schools in the mainland of the US. Then, since they lived full-time at the schools, the school had some special rights over the kids. During the Cold War, the US military made these kids drink radioactive stuff for experiments because the schools signed off on it. Obviously this has caused many of them to develop cancer, and many have had no reparations to this day. Edit: I wouldn't call this wholesome, but thanks for my first award. Also, there are more experiments, but the US has done a good job at burying this information. Kinda scary. The US military's actions in the Philippine-American War, also known as the Philippine Uprising. After the Spanish-American War, the Philippines became a US colony, and naturally the locals didn't like the idea of being handed over to another colonial power, especially when they had previously been slated for independence after the war, like Cuba. The war lasted from 1899 to 1905, and the US won with minimal losses against scattered local resistance. However, this was ultimately achieved because the US killed upwards of 1.4 million civilians in the Philippines over the course of the war in order to establish control by force and terror. They burned down and massacred entire towns and funneled thousands upon thousands of people into concentration camps, where many more died from disease or being murdered by soldiers in terrible conditions. More Philippine civilians were killed in the war than the US has lost in all its wars combined. Another 1.6 million would be killed by the time the Philippines became independent in 1946. While not as deadly as the Bengal famine or Belgian Congo, the brutality on display, which was then covered up, ignored, or later justified, is horrifying. The history of Liberia. Basically, people think it was a country founded by African American freed slaves. What many people don't know is that the land was already populated by native tribes which were basically enslaved by an African American elite. Native Liberians even started to call them whites. Despite being the only African country to never be colonized by the Europeans, Liberia is still one of the least developed countries in Africa, and the US never provided any kind of large-scale support. Unit 731. A Japanese unit during World War II who carried out extremely gruesome and lethal experiments on humans, including but not limited to vivisection without anesthesia, exposure to biological agents, testing weapon lethality, sleep/food/water deprivation, extreme radioactivity exposure, low-pressure chambers, burns, electrocutions, spinning to death in a centrifuge, injected with animal blood and seawater, forced frostbite, forced incestuous relationships, rape and forced pregnancies, etc. ad nauseum. General MacArthur offered the physicians and the leader of the unit immunity in exchange for the information gleaned from the unit's wicked evils. Quick warning, don't read this if you have a weak stomach. A lot of people have heard of the Donner Party, but a lot of people don't understand the specifics. I'll be honest with you, they kind of deserved some of the stuff they went through. They chose to take a trail that hadn't been traveled despite qualified people telling them not to. At one point after some of the cannibalism had begun, 2 natives from the Miwok tribe said nope and tried to leave. Afterwards they were hunted down and killed for food. They also ate a dude who was unconscious cause his hand fell in the fire, and they decided even though he wasn't dead that it was close enough. And at the end the last survivor was an old man who, though he claimed the other few people there had died of natural causes, had eaten the last couple of survivors who were with him. He even claimed that human flesh tasted better than anything else, which was why he hadn't eaten the last bit of oxen meat there. The dancing plague? So I'm fairly certain it may be more commonly known now. Battle of the Somme, one of the deadliest battles in history, and we don't talk about it much because it was in World War I. The queen of a Celtic tribe, Boadicea was her name, formed an uprising to fight the Romans because she was flogged, her daughters raped and her family enslaved. She ultimately failed, and some say she died by poisoning herself. No one really knows what happened. Not exactly a dark event but rather a hilarious one. It's called the Norwegian butter crisis. The Norwegian butter crisis began in late 2011 with an acute shortage of butter and inflation of its price across markets in Norway. The shortage caused soaring prices and stores' stocks of butter ran out within minutes of deliveries. The funny part is a lot of people were caught trying to sneak butter across the border and then got like a day in jail for it. Probably how many really awful people got away after World War II. 2 of the important ones, Japanese ones, were Nobusuke Kishi. He was in charge of Manchuria and basically turned the place into a massive work camp, similar to the Soviet Gulag system, but worse. He was also a serial rapist. He would later go on to serve as PM of Japan in the 50s. Shiroishi, he was in charge of Unit 731, the Japanese biological warfare unit. Besides some truly horrific experiments, he also created plague bombs that killed plus 100,000 Chinese. He was given amnesty in return for his findings. During the pre-Civil War era, slave masters would rape female slaves and force male slaves to rape them as well, in the name of breeding more slaves. If they became infertile, they brought in doctors to make them fertile again, by any means necessary. These doctors assumed that black women had high pain tolerance, so they didn't care about being ethical, let alone reducing pain. Nanjing Massacre, the most largest massacre in China during the Republican era. Japanese army killed an estimated of 40,000 to over 300,000. The Japanese killed and raped many of the people. Many soldiers went beyond rape to disembowel women, slice off their breasts, and nail them alive to walls. Fathers were forced to rape their daughters, and sons their mothers, as other family members watched. Not only did live burials, castration, the carving of organs, and the roasting of people become routine, but more diabolical tortures were practiced, such as hanging people by their tongues on iron hooks or burying people to their waists and watching them get torn apart by German shepherds. So sickening was the spectacle that even Nazis in the city were horrified, one proclaiming the massacre to be the work of bestial machinery. Till this day the memory of the Nanjing massacre has been a point of contention in Sino-Japanese relations. Google Saskatoon Starlight Tours. Basically European descent cops in Saskatchewan, Canada would pick up/arrest Indigenous people for random offences, take them on a road trip outside of town where they were dropped off in below freezing weather miles from where they were picked up. Canadians like to think we're so much better than Americans cause our cops don't kill black people, nor they go after the indigenous up here more than anybody. Don't maple wash at it. This happened from the 1970s forward to 2010s. The Ludlow Massacre was a massacre perpetrated by anti-striker militia during the Colorado Coalfield War. The Colorado National Guard and Colorado Fuel and Iron Company Guards attacked a tent colony of 1,200 striking coal miners and their families in Ludlow, Colorado, on April 20, 1914, with the National Guard using machine guns to fire into the colony. Approximately 21 people, including miners' wives and children, were killed. The chief owner of the mine, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was widely excoriated for having orchestrated the massacre. 5-6. One topic most Americans don't know about, but absolutely should, is the theft of Native American children by the government that went on until the 1970s. Racist social service agencies abused their power to take Native children away from their parents, to the point where 25 to 35% of families had a child removed from the household. These children were overwhelmingly given to white parents, separated from their cultures, and most never saw their birth parents again. It took all the way until 1978 when an act of Congress, the IQA, finally brought this barbaric, racist abuse to an end. American industrialist Henry Ford significantly contributed to the resurgence of anti-Semitism at the end of the 19th century and into World War I and pre-Holocaust era. Then the owner of the Dearborn Independent. His newspaper would spread anti-Jewish propaganda throughout every Ford dealership in the United States. Culminating with a series of books entitled The International Jew, the world's foremost problem. Adolf Hitler famously had a framed photo of Henry Ford in his office. The fact that Henry Ford is still quoted and idolized is a testimony to people's lack of understanding of history and context. North Korean prison camps, although I wouldn't call them history exactly as the situation is still ongoing. Read Eyes of the Tailless Animals by Lee Soon-ok, a camp survivor if you really want to know just how evil human beings can be. Much like the Armenian genocide, the Ottomans carried out a genocide against the Greek minority in what is now modern-day Turkey for almost a decade during and directly after World War I, so 1914-1922-ish I'm pretty sure. Most of the ethnic Greeks in Turkey that had been there for centuries were killed and those that remained were deported to Greece. It turns out that genocide was a fairly common practice in the Ottoman Empire, but it's interesting how history skips over much of the atrocities committed.